Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we share the most moving tales of hope, healing, and the power of human connection. Today, we bring you a story that will touch your heart deeply, of a homeless woman who sings not only for food but for redemption. Let her music fill your soul, as it does for those around her. Stay tuned for a powerful journey that proves kindness can change lives. Abigail Carter walked the bustling streets of Atlanta, her every step measured and slow, as though the weight of the world pressed against her small frame. At 42, she was a woman marked by life's hardships. Her once lustrous curly brown hair now lay dry and tangled around her thin shoulders, and her deep brown eyes, which could once light up a room, were clouded with exhaustion and sorrow. She had lost much over the years: her home, her family, her sense of belonging. What remained, however, was her voice. It was the one thing no one could take from her, the one thing she clung to, even in her darkest hours. She had been called many things on the streets: the woman in the square, the lonely singer, the voice of the city's forgotten. Abigail was a fixture in the busy heart of downtown Atlanta. She had no permanent place to stay, only the rhythm of the streets to guide her through the days. Some passers-by would drop a coin in her open guitar case, while others walked past without a second glance. But music had been her constant companion. From childhood, it had soothed her, carried her through storms, and whispered of possibilities when everything else in life seemed lost. Born in a small town in Georgia, Abigail's early years were filled with dreams of singing, of standing on a stage, of a life where her voice could be heard. But those dreams had been suffocated by the harshness of life, the expectations of a humble, working-class family who knew little of the artistic world had led Abigail to bury her ambitions deep inside her. Singing, to her parents, was a hobby, not a future. She would practice in her bedroom, standing in front of the mirror, imagining an audience that would applaud her every note. Yet, life had a different path in store for her. As she grew older, the dreams faded into the background, overtaken by struggles, hardships, and the bitter realities of adult life. By the time she reached her 30s, those dreams were all but forgotten. Now, Abigail found herself living on the streets, unable to make sense of the life she had once hoped for. The days blurred into each other, and the nights stretched long and cold. Yet, amidst the emptiness, there was one constant: her music. She sang not for the coins, but for the catharsis, for the chance to let the sorrow and loss spill out of her soul and into the open air, where maybe, just maybe, someone might hear her. On most days, she sang her usual set of blues and jazz, songs filled with longing, pain, and a quiet hope that still flickered deep within her. One chilly evening in late September, after a long day of singing in the square, Abigail wandered down the street to a familiar place. It was a small restaurant on the corner, called Melody's Kitchen. She had passed by the place countless times, always drawn in by the warm, inviting smells of fresh bread and hearty dishes. The manager, Marcus Reed, had seen her before, often exchanging silent nods of acknowledgement. But tonight, as Abigail hovered outside the restaurant, Marcus noticed something different about her. She stood by the door, her usually calm and composed demeanor weighed down by exhaustion. Her clothes were dirtier than usual, her hands trembling as she clutched her worn-out bag. Marcus could tell she hadn't eaten in some time, her gaunt cheeks a stark contrast to the woman he had often seen at a distance. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, a sadness that went beyond hunger. Unable to ignore the ache in his heart, Marcus stepped outside, his voice gentle but firm. "Are you hungry?" he asked softly. Abigail looked up, her tired eyes meeting his, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Marcus hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Maybe you could sing a little something for us, in exchange for a meal, just a song or two," he suggested, unsure of how she would react. It was an unusual request, but Marcus had seen something in Abigail, a light, a spark that he didn't want to let go unnoticed. Abigail hesitated, singing indoors in front of strangers. It had been years since she had done anything like that. Yet, the thought of a warm meal, something other than the scraps she had become accustomed to, tugged at her. With a deep sigh, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but full of a quiet acceptance. Together, they walked into Melody's kitchen. The space was small, with soft lighting that created an intimate atmosphere. Tables set neatly around the room. As Abigail settled into a corner, she felt a strange calmness wash over her. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then began to sing. At first, her voice was soft, tentative, but as she sang, the power of her voice grew, filling the room with a richness and depth that seemed to captivate everyone around her. Each note carried with it an emotional weight, a rawness that made the air seem still. The patrons who were dining quietly at their tables stopped, their attention caught by the unexpected performance. A few looked up, their eyes widening in surprise as the melody filled the room. When she finished, there was a brief silence, a collective holding of breath. Then, the room erupted in gentle applause. Marcus approached her, offering a plate of food with a smile. "Thank you," he said softly, his heart swelling with gratitude. Abigail returned the smile, her eyes shining with a quiet, unspoken thanks, not just for the meal, but for the kindness that had been extended to her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Little did she know, this simple act of singing in exchange for food would be the beginning of a new chapter for Abigail, a chapter that would not only change her life, but also touch the hearts of many others. In the following weeks, Abigail's presence at Melody's kitchen became a quiet ritual. She would arrive on the colder evenings, after a day spent in the streets, and sing a few songs in exchange for a warm meal. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. Her voice, raw and filled with emotion, began to transform the small, cozy restaurant. What started as an act of charity soon became a treasured experience for the patrons who came to hear her sing. The manager, Marcus, had always been kind to Abigail, but now he began to see the full impact of her talent. Her voice had a haunting quality, capable of touching something deep within those who listened. The regulars started to come back more often, not for the food, but for Abigail's music. Some of them would bring their friends, and word began to spread. Melody's Kitchen was no longer just a place for dinner. It had become a destination. The once quiet restaurant was now bustling, its tables full of people eager to hear Abigail sing. The atmosphere was different. There was an unspoken connection between the diners, as if they all shared the same moment, experiencing the same emotions through Abigail's music. They didn't just come for food anymore. They came to listen, to feel, and to be moved. One evening, as the crowd swelled, Marcus sat down to look over the week's reports. He couldn't help but notice the uptick in sales. It wasn't just a small increase, it was significant. His eyes scanned the numbers again, but there was no special promotion or marketing campaign that could explain this growth. Curious, he called over Ethan, the restaurant's owner, to discuss the situation. "Marcus, what's going on with these numbers?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but probing. "We're seeing more customers, but we haven't launched any new promotions or ads. Have you been running any specials?" Marcus hesitated, unsure of how to explain the unusual turn of events. "Well, sir," he began, "there's been a singer, a homeless woman. Actually, I've let her sing in exchange for food a few nights a week, and people seem to really love her voice. It's been drawing in a crowd." Ethan raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "A homeless singer?" He repeated the words, his mind running through all the potential complications. "How does that even work?" Marcus smiled, almost embarrassed at the simplicity of the explanation. "She's incredible. Ethan, you really have to hear her. People started showing up just to hear her sing, and now it's become a bit of a phenomenon around here." For a moment, Ethan was speechless. His first instinct was to dismiss it as a quirky coincidence, something that wouldn't last. Yet, the numbers didn't lie. There was something happening here that went beyond the usual rhythms of his business. His curiosity piqued. He decided to see it for himself. The next evening, Ethan dressed casually in worn jeans and a cap, choosing a quiet table in the back of the restaurant. He didn't want to be noticed as the owner, wanting to experience the performance as a regular diner would. As the evening unfolded, he began to wonder if Marcus had been exaggerating. The restaurant was bustling, the noise of chatter and clinking cutlery filling the air. But Abigail hadn't yet taken the stage. Then, as if on cue, the noise dropped to a soft murmur as Abigail stepped forward, taking her place at the small makeshift stage. Her figure was quiet at first, almost hesitant, but then she began to sing. The song was soft at first, her voice barely rising above a whisper. But as it grew, so did the power behind it. Ethan was immediately captivated. There was something haunting about the way she sang. Her voice was not just technically skilled, but filled with an emotion that seemed to transcend the simple notes she produced. Each word felt like it carried with it a lifetime of experience, of pain and longing and hope. And her audience felt it. The room was still, everyone caught in the same collective moment, their hearts moved by the power of her voice. As Abigail finished the song, there was a beat of silence, the kind of silence that fills a room after something truly profound has happened. Then, slowly, the patrons began to clap, some of them standing, others with tears in their eyes. Ethan sat frozen in his seat, his mind reeling. He had never expected this, never anticipated how deeply he would be moved by the performance. Her voice had touched something deep within him, something that he had long buried. In that moment, he realized that this restaurant was no longer just a business to him. It had become something far greater, something filled with a shared vulnerability and understanding. After the applause faded and the patrons returned to their meals, Ethan stayed seated, reflecting on what he had just witnessed. He had thought he was just a businessman running a restaurant. But now, after hearing Abigail's voice, he felt like he was witnessing something far more profound, a moment of healing, of redemption, not just for Abigail, but for everyone in the room. In the days that followed, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Abigail. He returned to his normal routine, overseeing the restaurant's operations. But his thoughts were often elsewhere, lingering on her voice, the depth of her songs, and the profound effect they had on everyone in the room. There was something about Abigail, something that went beyond her music. Her voice seemed to tap into a universal sorrow, a shared human experience. And in that moment, her pain became everyone's pain. Marcus noticed the shift in Ethan. The owner, who had once been laser-focused on growing his restaurant, now seemed preoccupied with something else entirely. It wasn't just the business that had changed, it was him. There was a quiet introspection in the way he carried himself now, something deeply moved by the connection he had witnessed between Abigail and the patrons. He had always believed that a restaurant was more than just a place to eat. It was a space for people to come together, to share moments. But now he was beginning to understand that Abigail had turned Melody's Kitchen into something much deeper, a sanctuary for the brokenhearted, a place where people could find solace in the power of music. Abigail continued to sing each night, her performances growing stronger, more vulnerable. She never spoke much, keeping to herself during the day, but her songs had a way of speaking for her. Each note she sang carried a piece of her soul, and the more she sang, the more the audience began to understand that there was so much more to her story than what was visible on the surface. One evening, after Abigail finished another soul-stirring performance, Ethan found himself waiting for her as the restaurant emptied. The room felt quieter now, as if it had absorbed all of her emotions, and he knew that it was time to speak with her. He'd been observing her for weeks, noticing the way she seemed to pull away from people, the way her eyes would sometimes carry a faraway look. But there was also something fragile, something that made him want to protect her, to offer her the safety she had never known. As Abigail sat at the corner table, sipping her tea, her hands gently tracing the rim of her cup, Ethan approached her. There was a moment of hesitation before he spoke. "Abigail," he began softly, unsure of how to approach her. "I just wanted to say, your music, it's changing everything here. People are connecting with you in a way I've never seen before. It's like you're healing them." Abigail gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She placed her cup down and took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for something uncomfortable. "I didn't ask for this," she murmured, her voice tinged with both gratitude and sadness. "I didn't ask to be heard, but sometimes it's the only way to survive. Music is all I have left." Ethan sat across from her, his eyes filled with sympathy. "I can't even imagine what you've been through, Abigail, but I want you to know that you've given us more than just music. You've given us a glimpse into something real, something honest. It's not just your voice, it's who you are." There was a long silence between them as Abigail looked down, her fingers lightly touching the edge of her cup. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with a depth of emotion that made Ethan's heart ache. "I've lost so much," she whispered, "more than I care to remember. But every time I sing, it's like I'm piecing myself back together. My life, my story, it's all in the music. I can't forget what happened, but singing helps me survive it." Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind swirling with the realization that there was so much more to Abigail than what he had initially seen. She wasn't just a homeless woman with a beautiful voice. She was someone who had experienced profound loss, and her music was the thread that kept her from falling apart. "Do you ever think about sharing your story?" Ethan asked gently, knowing that it was a personal question. "Your music speaks for you, but maybe people would understand you better if you let them in." Abigail's face softened, and for a moment, Ethan could see the vulnerability behind her walls. She took a deep breath, as if weighing whether or not she was ready to open up. Then, with a quiet nod, she spoke. "It's not that simple. There are parts of me that I don't think I'm ready to share. But maybe one day." Her voice trailed off, leaving the conversation suspended in the air. Ethan wanted to say something comforting, but he knew better than to push her. He reached out and gently placed a hand on hers, a gesture of understanding. "Whenever you're ready," he said, his voice steady but filled with compassion. "You're not alone here, Abigail." The moment lingered between them, heavy with unspoken words. But it was enough. For the first time, Abigail allowed herself to feel the warmth of acceptance, something she hadn't felt in years. She looked up at Ethan with a faint smile, her eyes reflecting a mix of sorrow and hope. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for believing in me." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. He knew that Abigail's journey was far from over, but somehow it had already begun to change everything for her. The healing process had started, not just for Abigail, but for everyone who had been touched by her music. As she walked out of the restaurant that night, the air outside felt different, lighter. For the first time in a long while, Abigail allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she belonged. The weeks passed, and Abigail's performances at the restaurant became the heart of harmonies. Each night, her songs continued to resonate deeply with the patrons, and the once modest restaurant was now always filled with people eager to hear her voice. But as much as she poured herself into each note, there remained a sense of quiet sadness in her eyes, a sorrow that seemed to linger even as her music gave so much to others. Ethan had noticed the subtle change in Abigail. There were nights when her usual energy was replaced by a deep fatigue. Her eyes, once so full of hope and passion, had begun to carry a weight that Ethan couldn't ignore. The warmth in her voice was still there, but there were moments when her songs faltered, when it seemed as though the words she sang were not just about love or loss, but about something she hadn't yet let go of. One evening, after a particularly moving performance, Ethan stayed behind, watching Abigail quietly. She hadn't noticed him yet, lost in her own thoughts as she gathered her things. He felt a surge of concern. Something in her demeanor told him that she was fighting a battle within herself, something that went beyond the music, something that had been buried for a long time. When the last of the patrons left, Ethan walked over to her, his steps quiet but deliberate. Abigail looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected anyone to approach her in this vulnerable moment. She gave him a small, nervous smile, but Ethan could tell that her mind was elsewhere. "I've been thinking about you," Ethan said softly, standing beside her. Your voice, it's amazing. But I feel like there's something more. Abigail, something that you're holding back. Abigail looked down, her hand shaking slightly as she placed her things on the table. She had always been careful, keeping her heart guarded, hiding the scars from her past. But something about Ethan's words, his kindness, made her feel as though the walls she had built around herself were beginning to crack. It's just, Abigail hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. There's something I need to let go of, a part of me that I've been holding on to for so long, and I don't know if I'm ready to face it. But every time I sing, it's like I'm inching closer to that moment. I just don't know how to let go. Ethan sat beside her, offering her the space to speak, even as he felt the weight of her words settle between them. He had always admired her strength, the way she faced the world with resilience despite everything she had been through. But he could see now that she was carrying a burden, a piece of herself that she hadn't yet allowed to heal. You don't have to do it alone, Abigail, Ethan said gently, his voice filled with sincerity. Whatever it is, we can face it together. You don't have to keep it hidden anymore. Abigail took a shaky breath, her eyes filling with unshed tears. She had spent so many years pretending to be strong, pretending that she had everything under control. But the truth was, she had been running from her pain, from the life she had once known, from the love she had lost. And now, for the first time, she felt as though she could stop running. I lost someone once, Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. Someone I loved more than anything in this world. And when I lost him, I lost myself. It's been so long, but the pain never really goes away. It just gets buried deeper and deeper. And every time I sing, it's like I'm opening that wound again. But I have to. I have to face it, or I'll never be whole again. Ethan reached out and placed a hand on hers, his touch warm and comforting. Abigail, you've already taken the first step by sharing this with me. And you've taken another by allowing yourself to be vulnerable through your music. You've already begun to heal, whether you realize it or not. For a moment, there was silence. Abigail closed her eyes, allowing the weight of her emotions to settle around her. It was a strange feeling, this sense of release, this acknowledgement that she could finally confront the past and allow herself to heal. But it also terrified her. The fear of confronting the truth had kept her in the shadows for so long. I think it's time, Abigail said softly, her voice filled with determination. It's time to sing the last song, the one I've been holding on to all these years, the one I need to say goodbye to. Ethan nodded, understanding that this would be the moment she had been waiting for. I'll be right here, he said, his voice steady. You don't have to face this alone. Abigail stood up slowly, her hands trembling as she approached the makeshift stage. The room was quiet, as though everyone could feel the shift in the air. There was an anticipation, a sense that something important was about to happen. Abigail stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room full of familiar faces. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear, but she knew it was time. As the first notes of her song filled the air, Ethan watched her closely. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, he saw a look of peace wash over her face. The song was soft at first, a whisper of a melody, but as it built, it became something powerful, something raw and vulnerable. Each note seemed to tell the story of her life, of love lost, of heartache, of survival. And when Abigail's voice reached its peak, Ethan felt the depth of her pain, but also the immense strength that had carried her through the darkness. The room was silent, every eye on her, every heart connected to the emotions she was pouring into the song. When the final note rang out, Abigail stood still, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the release. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the room erupted in applause, soft at first, then growing louder as the full magnitude of the moment set in. It was a moment of closure, of healing, of redemption, and for Abigail, it was a moment of peace. Ethan stood up, his heart full as he watched her. She had done it. She had finally let go of the past, and in doing so, had freed herself. As she made her way off the stage, he walked to meet her, his heart full of pride and admiration. This was the woman he had always known she could be, the woman who had fought through the storm and come out stronger on the other side. "You did it," Ethan said quietly, taking her hand. Abigail smiled, a genuine smile this time, one that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me." The weeks following that final, cathartic performance were transformative. Harmony's restaurant had evolved from a simple eatery to a sanctuary, a place where people could find not only good food but healing through music and connection. Abigail's presence there had turned the once quiet evenings into vibrant nights filled with emotion. Her voice had become the soul of the place, and her performances were no longer just about a homeless woman singing for food. They had become an experience, a chance to witness someone's raw, beautiful redemption. Abigail, for the first time in years, felt at peace. The haunting melodies she sang no longer felt like a burden, but a bridge to a new life, one where she could embrace both the pain and the healing. She had begun to open up to the people around her. Ethan, Marcus, and even some of the regular patrons had become her support system, and their presence filled her with a quiet strength that she had never known before. The restaurant that once offered her a warm meal now provided her with something far more valuable, a sense of belonging. As for Ethan, the connection he had with Abigail continued to grow deeper. What had started as a simple admiration for her talent had blossomed into a profound bond, built on shared experiences, understanding, and a growing affection for one another. They would spend hours together after closing, sipping tea or coffee, talking about life, music, and the journeys that had led them to this point. Ethan had been a part of her healing, but Abigail had also helped him in ways he didn't expect. Before Abigail's arrival, Harmony's had been a place Ethan poured all his energy into. But in the weeks that followed her performances, he found himself contemplating what really mattered: human connection, love, and the resilience of the human spirit. He realized that his restaurant had become a symbol of second chances, not just for Abigail, but for anyone who had ever felt broken or lost. It had grown into more than just a business. It had become a place where people came to find solace. One evening, after closing, Ethan walked into the restaurant to find Abigail sitting at the bar, her face thoughtful as she stared out at the empty tables. The last customer had just left, and the silence in the room felt different. It was peaceful, almost sacred. "You're quiet tonight," Ethan said, walking over to join her. He could tell she was deep in thought, as if something was weighing heavily on her mind. Abigail turned to him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet sadness. But there was also a sense of resolution in her gaze. "I've been thinking," she began slowly, her voice soft, "about what comes next. I've let go of so much, Ethan, but there's still so much more I need to face." Ethan nodded, understanding that the journey she had begun wasn't over. The song she had sung, the release she had felt, those were important steps. But the road to truly reclaiming her life was ongoing. "What do you need, Abigail?" he asked gently, his hand resting on the counter, a silent offer of support. "I want to go back to Georgia," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to see my family. I don't know what's left of them, but I need to go home. I need to face the past and say goodbye." Ethan felt a pang in his chest, knowing that letting go of someone he cared about was never easy. But he understood. "Then you should go," he said, "and I'll be here whenever you're ready to come back." Abigail's eyes softened, gratitude filling her heart. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The days leading up to her departure were bittersweet. The patrons who had come to know Abigail, some of whom had found healing in her music, expressed their thanks and goodbyes, with many wishing her well on her journey. Marcus, too, had come to consider Abigail not just a customer, but a dear friend. "I'll miss you, Abby," he said, giving her a heartfelt hug before she left. "You've brought so much life into this place." As the day came for her to leave, Abigail stood outside Harmony's, the sun beginning to set behind her. She had done it. She had faced her demons, let go of her past, and found a new home, a place where her soul had finally been free to sing. But now, She was ready to face the next chapter of her life, with or without the answer she sought. With one last glance at the restaurant, Abigail turned and walked toward the bus station, the weight of the years lifting off her shoulders with each step. Ethan watched her go from the doorway, his heart full but heavy. He didn't know if she would return, but he knew that wherever her journey took her, she would always carry the strength she had found within herself. And though the night would fall silent without her songs, Ethan understood. Her voice would forever be etched in the walls of harmonies, a reminder of the power of music, love, and resilience. As he turned off the lights and locked the door behind him, he couldn't help but smile. He knew that the place he had built was no longer just a restaurant. It was a sanctuary where people could come to heal, to find connection, and to witness the transformation of a woman who had finally come home to herself. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of resilience, love, and transformation. Abigail's story reminds us that music, kindness, and a little help from others can heal even the deepest wounds. If her story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Let's spread the message of hope together. See you in the next story.